The tribal people, spread over a large part of India, organized hundreds of militant outbreaks and insurrections during the 19th century. These uprisings were marked by immense courage and sacrifice on their part and brutal suppression and veritable butchery on the part of the rulers. The tribals had cause to be upset for a variety of reasons. The colonial administration ended their relative isolation and brought them fully within the ambit of colonialism. It recognized the tribal chiefs as zemindars and introduced a new system of land revenue and taxation of tribal products. It encouraged the influx of Christian missionaries into the tribal areas. Above all, it introduced a large number of money lenders, traders and revenue farmers as middlemen among the tribals. These middlemen were the chief instruments for bringing the tribal people within the vortex of the colonial economy and exploitation. The middlemen were outsiders who increasingly took possession of tribal lands and ensnared the tribals in a web of debt. In time, the tribal people increasingly lost their lands and were reduced to the position of agricultural laborers, sharecroppers and rack-rented tenants on the land they had earlier brought under cultivation and held on a communal basis. Colonialism also transformed their relationship with the forest. They had depended on the forest for food, fuel and cattle feed. They practiced shifting cultivation, jam, podu, etc., taking recourse to fresh forest lands when their existing lands showed signs of exhaustion. The colonial government changed all this. It usurped the forest lands and placed restrictions on access to forest products, forest lands and village common lands. It refused to let cultivation shift to new areas. Oppression and extortion by policemen and other petty officials further aggravated distress among the tribals. The revenue farmers and government agents also intensified and expanded the system of bigger, making the tribals perform unpaid labor. All this differed in intensity from region to region, but the complete disruption of the old agrarian order of the tribal communities provided the common factor for all the tribal uprisings. These uprisings were broad-based, involving thousands of tribals, often the entire population of a region. The colonial intrusion and the triumvirate of trader, moneylender and revenue farmer in sum disrupted the tribal identity to a lesser or greater degree. In fact, ethnic ties were a basic feature of the tribal rebellions. The rebels saw themselves not as a discrete class but as having a tribal identity. At this level, the solidarity shown was of a very high order. Fellow tribals were never attacked unless they had collaborated with the enemy. At the same time, not all outsiders were attacked as enemies. Often there was no violence against the non-tribal poor, who worked in tribal villages in supportive economic roles, or who had social relations with the tribals, such as tulis, gwalas, lohars, carpenters, potters, weavers, washermen, barbers, drummers, and bonded laborers and domestic servants of the outsiders. They were not only spared, but were seen as allies. In many cases, the rural poor formed a part of the rebellious tribal bands. The rebellions normally began at the point where the tribals felt so oppressed that they felt they had no alternative but to fight. This often took the form of spontaneous attacks on outsiders, looting their property and expelling them from their villages. This led to clashes with the colonial authorities. When this happened, the tribals began to move towards armed resistance and elementary organization. Often, religious and charismatic leaders, messiahs, emerged at this stage and promised divine intervention and an end to their suffering at the hands of the outsiders, and asked their fellow tribals to rise and rebel against foreign authority. Most of these leaders claimed to derive their authority from God. They also often claimed that they possessed magical powers, for example, the power to make the enemy's bullets ineffective. Filled with hope and confidence, the tribal masses tended to follow these leaders to the very end. The warfare between the tribal rebels and the British armed forces was totally unequal. On one side were drilled regiments armed with the latest weapons, and on the other were men and women fighting in roving bands armed with primitive weapons such as stones, axes, spears and bows and arrows, believing in the magical powers of their commanders. The tribals died in lakhs in this unequal warfare. Among the numerous tribal revolts, the Santhal uprising was the most massive. The Santhals, who live in the area between Bhagalpur and Rajmahal, known as Damanikon, rose in revolt, made a determined attempt to expel the outsiders, the Daikas, and proclaimed the complete annihilation of the alien regime. The social conditions which drove them to insurrection were described by a contemporary in the Calcutta Review as follows: Zemindars, the police, the revenue and court alas have exercised a combined system of extortions, oppressive exactions, forcible dispossession of property, abuse and personal violence, and a variety of petty tyrannies upon the timid and yielding Santhals. Usurious interest on loans of money ranging from 50 to 500%, false measures at the hot and the market, willful and uncharitable trespass by the rich by means of their untethered cattle, tutus, ponies and even elephants, on the growing crops of the poorer race, and such like illegalities have been prevalent. The Santhals considered the Daikas and government servants morally corrupt, being given to beggary, stealing, lying and drunkenness. By 1854, the tribal heads, the Majors and Paganites, had begun to meet and discuss the possibility of revolting. Stray cases of the robbing of zemindars and money-lenders began to occur. The tribal leaders called an assembly of nearly 6,000 Santhals, representing 400 villages, at Barganadihi on the 30th of June 1855. It was decided to raise the banner of revolt, get rid of the outsiders and their colonial masters once and for all, the assurance Satug, their reign of truth, and true justice. The Santhals believed that their actions had the blessings of God. Saido and Kanu, the principal rebel leaders, claimed that Thaka, God, had communicated with them and told them to take up arms and fight for independence. Saido told the authorities in a proclamation, "The Thakor has ordered me, saying that the country is not Sahib's. The Thakor himself will fight. Therefore, you Sahibs and soldiers will fight the Thakor himself." The leaders mobilized the Santhal men and women by organizing huge processions through the villages accompanied by drummers and other musicians. The leaders rode at the head on horses and elephants and in palkis. Soon nearly 60,000 Santhals had been mobilized, forming bands of 1,500 to 2,000, but rallying in many thousands at the call of drums on particular occasions. They attacked the Mohajans and Zemindars and their houses, police stations, railway construction sites, the dak, post, carriers, in fact all the symbols of Daiku exploitation and colonial power. The Santhal insurrection was helped by a large number of non-tribal and poor Daikas. Gwalas, milkmen, and others helped the rebels with provisions and services. Lohars, blacksmiths, accompanied the rebel bands, keeping their weapons in good shape. Once the government realized the scale of the rebellion, it organized a major military campaign against the rebels. It mobilized tens of regiments under the command of a major general, declared martial law in the affected areas and offered rewards of up to Rs. 10,000 for the capture of various leaders. The rebellion was crushed ruthlessly. More than 15,000 Santhals were killed while tens of villages were destroyed. Saido was betrayed and captured and killed in August 1855 while Kanu was arrested by accident at the tail end of the rebellion in February 1866. And the Rajmahal hills were drenched with the blood of the fighting Santhal peasantry. One typical instance of the heroism of Santhal rebels has been narrated by LSS O'Malley. They showed the most reckless courage, never knowing when they were beaten and refusing to surrender. On one occasion, 45 Santhals took refuge in a mud hut which they held against the sepoys. Volley after volley was fired into it. Each time the Santhals replied with a discharge of arrows. At last, when their fire ceased, the sepoys entered the hut and found only one old man was left alive. A sepoy called on him to surrender, whereupon the old man rushed upon him and cut him down with his battle axe. I shall describe briefly three other major tribal rebellions. The Kols of Khatnagpur rebelled from 1820 to 1837. Thousands of them were massacred before British authority could be reimposed. The hill tribesmen of Rampane Coastal Andhra revolted in March 1879 against the depredations of the government-supported Mansabdar and the new restrictive forest regulations. The authorities had to mobilize regiments of infantry, a squadron of cavalry and 2 companies of sappers and miners before the rebels, numbering several thousands, could be defeated by the end of 1880. The rebellion, Al-Gulan, of the Munda tribesmen, led by Birsa Munda, occurred during 1899 to 1900. For over 30 years the Munda Sardars had been struggling against the destruction of their system of common land holdings by the intrusion of Jagirdars, thicketers, revenue farmers, and merchant money-lenders. Birsa, born in a poor sharecropper household in 1874, had a vision of God in 1895. He declared himself to be a divine messenger, possessing miraculous healing powers. Thousands gathered around him, seeing in him a messiah with a new religious message. Under the influence of the Sardars, the religious movement soon acquired an agrarian and political content. Birsa began to move from village to village, organizing rallies and mobilizing his followers on religious and political grounds. On Christmas Eve, 1899, Birsa proclaimed a rebellion to establish Munda rule in the land and encouraged the killing of thicketers and Jagirdars and Rajas and Hakims, rulers, and Christians. Satug would be established in place of the present-day Kalyug. He declared that there was going to be a fight with the Daikas. The ground would be as red as the red flag with their blood. The non-tribal poor were not to be attacked. To bring about liberation, Birsa gathered a force of 6,000 Mundas armed with swords, spears, battle-axes, and bows and arrows. He was, however, captured in the beginning of February 1900 and he died in jail in June. The rebellion had failed. But Birsa entered the realms of legend.